Today's episode is brought to you by Malwarebytes Premium Security. Protect your computers and devices from cyber attacks 24/7 with Malwarebytes Premium Security. And go to malwarebytes.com/lock and code for an exclusive offer. That's malwarebytes.com/lock and code.
These surveillance systems are largely black box systems, so we don't know everything that's pouring into them, but we can assume that it's like not only every policing and law enforcement database, it's also social media, it's perhaps shopping data from like people's rewards cards, it's license plate readers, it's facial recognition, it's DNA databases. Like, it is a huge amount of information being gathered on people who are kind of just minding their business.
This is Lock and Code, a Malwarebytes podcast. I'm your host, David Ruiz. Our main story today is about predictive policing. In the late 2010s, a group of sheriffs out of Pasco County, Florida, believed they could predict crime. The sheriff's department there had piloted a program called intelligence-led policing, and the program would allegedly analyze disparate points of data to identify would-be criminals. But in reality, the program didn't so much predict crime as it did make criminals out of everyday people, including children. High schoolers' grades were fed into this system, along with their attendance records and their history with office discipline. And on the other side, sheriffs would be instructed who to visit, who to check in on, and who to pester. As reported by the Tampa Bay Times in 2020, quote, "They swarm homes in the middle of the night, waking families and embarrassing people in front of their neighbors. They write tickets for missing mailbox numbers and overgrown grass, saddling residents with court dates and fines. They come again and again, making arrests for any reason they can." One former deputy described the directive like this: "Make their lives miserable until they move or sue." End quote. Predictive policing can sound like science fiction, yes, but it is neither scientific nor is it confined to fiction. Police and sheriff's departments will plug whatever data they can find into algorithmic models to try and predict not just who may be a criminal, but where crime may take place. Historical crime data, traffic information, even weather patterns are sometimes offered up to tech platforms to suggest where, when, and how forcefully police units should be deployed. And when the police go to those areas, they often find and document minor infractions that, when reported, reinforce the algorithmic analysis that an area is crime-ridden, even if those crimes are, as the Tampa Bay Times investigation found, a teenager smoking a cigarette or stray trash bags outside a home. Today, to help us understand predictive policing, how it is applied, and who it harms, we're speaking with Emily Galvin-Almanza, co-founder of Partners for Justice and author of the upcoming book, The Price of Mercy. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are very excited to have you here. We have a lot to get into today. And while I think I start most episodes with like some background, like, hey, how does this work? Where is this happening? There's a more important question here with predictive policing, which is just really at the outset, does predictive policing work? And that's in quotation marks, but does predictive policing work?
Yeah, I can feel your air quotes in your voice. So it's a complicated question. There's obviously a lot of police departments who are eager to claim that it does. However, it's very hard to say. I'm going to define work as meaning, does it make us safer? Because I'm assuming that that's what most people want from policing. When we look at the question of does it make it safer, there are departments who have claimed, hey, in the year before we had this new technology, the crime rate was this. In the year after, the crime rate was that. And they attribute that drop to the new technology. Crime data, though, is really, really complex, and it's hard to say whether mass surveillance is causative or correlative with other factors that may have lowered crime independently. I'll give you an example. In the years since COVID, we have seen a real drop in crime. There was a spike in crime after COVID, and then a drop following that. Now, there's been a lot of really great initiatives in the years since 2020, community violence interruption, and like really smart safety interventions that I think there's great data on that I would attribute a lot of that drop in crime to. But we also have to recognize that in the period following COVID, everybody had just been trapped inside with each other for a really long time with like too much toilet paper and like nothing to do. And it is natural that when you confine people, when you stress them out, when you traumatize them, so many people died and were dying. We had bodies being removed from our streets. Like this was a period of extreme trauma for most people. Obviously, interpersonal violence is going to rise during a period of confinement and trauma. And it's going to fall again once people start to get back to normal. So as much as I would love to attribute the entirety of that drop to interventions I believe really work, I have to be circumspect and say, there's probably also other societal factors at play and situational contextual factors at play. I have not yet seen a study of predictive policing technology that convinces me, as someone who reads a lot of studies about safety, that it really works, especially because, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, in this interview, when we talk about predictive policing, it's a huge umbrella of things that ranges from really badly executed mass surveillance of largely innocent people to like kind of thoughtful ways to think about where crime might be happening and try to adapt our tactics. And like, obviously the thoughtful stuff probably works better than the mass surveillance stuff. But no, in general, I am not ready to say based on the data that I've seen any convincing evidence that predictive policing is meaningfully making people safer.
I think there's some interesting things you pointed out there that I like immediately wanted to touch on. Like you said, COVID was this really bizarre time for crime stats. And interestingly, it was a bizarre time. I know this is going to sound weird. It was a bizarre time for malware stats. Like we detect and we help folks remove something called stalkerware, often referred to as stalkerware. It enables non-consensual spying between romantic partners, intimate partners, right? Wives, spouses. And there was an enormous increase during shelter-in-place orders. And we have our own reasons for why we think that is. Couples that were separated, maybe there were abusive partners that wanted to increase surveillance during that separation. But also couples who lived together, they also wanted to increase surveillance. So again, just kind of get to this idea here of COVID increased crime. Like non-consensual surveillance is crime. And also, this said this thing here about we were removing bodies from streets. I think folks have a real quick way to forget. We were using trucks, like we were using, 18-wheelers as morgues in New York City. I didn't live there, but my friend was a doctor who worked there. And guys, it really was that bad. Like folks, it was that. I wanted to get back into predictive policing here though, really quick, and understand what is it lead to in actual practice, right? Because you said there's different models here, right? There's this like mass surveillance, and then there's this kind of thoughtful approach sometimes about, where could it happen? But what does that look like in terms of, folks on the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm actually going to use a framework that I need to attribute to Andrew Ferguson, who wrote a book called The Rise of Big Data Policing, which is an excellent book. I really, really recommend it. I think the answer to this question can be divided kind of into 4 categories. Category number 1 is it does change police behavior. Police behavior is traditionally reactive. Bad things happen and people call the police and the police come and they investigate. But this technology makes police behave in a way that is more proactive. Generally, these technologies are kind of either predicting the crime of places or predicting the crime of people. And we can get into the differences between those two models. Predicting people is really problematic in a lot of ways. Predicting places, you don't even necessarily need big technology to do. I think one of my favorite examples in Andrew's book was if you see a spike in car thefts in a particular parking lot at a particular time, you can just respond to those car thefts, or you can ask, why is this consistently happening in this place and at this time? And you might discover that in this lot, in the mornings when it's cold outside, people are going down and starting their cars and letting the car warm up before they get in to drive. And while the car is sitting there running unattended, it's easy to steal.
Whoa.
So like, you could respond to that in a number of different ways. You can send more of a police presence to police the lot. You can tell people not to do that. You can like, put a gate up around the parking structure that people need to swipe into and out of. Like, there's a lot of different ways to deal with that. I mention it because that's an example to me of like a smart way of approaching prediction. But it's also not like something that requires mass surveillance. It just requires a little bit of thought about like, why is this thing happening at this place? So going back to how it changes police behavior. It changes where police choose to be and who they choose to be looking at. So for example, in models where in the morning police are given like a heat map of where crime is expected to be in a given jurisdiction, departments have had problems getting police to go outside the little boxes that they're told are the hottest on the heat map and like walk around in other parts of the neighborhood. In models that are creating a heat list of people, we obviously get a really, really intense policing focus on specific individuals. Now, police have always focused on specific individuals. Obviously, people develop reputations with the police in their community, and also police develop like really weird suspicions. I mean, I can tell you strange stories about police literally surveilling Romani people in a given jurisdiction because they believe that Romani people are predisposed to theft. I mean, really, really, really weird, super biased police ideology. In some ways, this technology can sanitize really biased policing choices as it is. So thing number one, it might cause the police to go places where they don't usually go, or not go to places where they perhaps should go. It can cause them to focus on people in a way that they feel is justified rather than perhaps based on personal animosity, bias, or a legitimate evidentiary reason. And that's because the second thing that this technology does is it sanitizes the bias. So if you're a police officer and you think a particular neighborhood is a bad neighborhood, and in truth, the reason you think that is because this is a very low-income neighborhood with a primarily Black and brown population. And police have a tendency, there's so much research on this, to over-police and over-criminalize Black people, especially in low-income neighborhoods. The root of these policing decisions, why are the police in this neighborhood, may be based in bias. It's a low-income neighborhood with a lot of Black people in it. The presence of police itself can then drive up the arrest rate in that neighborhood. There may be a completely equal amount of crime, let's say drug crime and domestic violence, happening in a white suburban neighborhood 5 miles away, but police aren't there and no one is calling them. They are hyper-policing and hyper-surveilling the low-income neighborhood, and because of that, arrest rates are higher there, which then, if you feed arrest rate data into a predictive policing system, the algorithm is going to tell you, hey, that neighborhood is a neighborhood you should absolutely be policing, there's tons of arrests there. Well, there's tons of arrests there because that's where the police chose to be in the first place. But now, instead of us recognizing like we need to question the rationale for why police are so heavy in this neighborhood and not at all in the other neighborhood, we have an algorithmically sanitized reason to be there. Oh, we're there because the AI told us we should be there. Not because I have a gut feeling that when I see poor people, I should police them harder. And I'm not trying to attribute that view to like all police. I'm just saying that like any other profession, there's like great people in it and there's terrible people in it. Like look at people who work at the DMV. There's DMV heroes and there's people whose counter you don't want to go to. And that's true in policing as in any other profession. So that's two things. It changes police behavior. It bakes in the bias and sanitizes the bias. Another thing is that it meaningfully changes our freedoms. If you are living in a neighborhood where predictive policing is causing mass surveillance of all of your friends and neighbors, it may change whether you choose to associate with people inside or outside your home. It may change where you choose to go. I think we often think of predictive policing and police technology in like the most favorable context. We're like, in a world where the law is totally fair and all of the laws criminalize things we actually want criminalized, then this technology lets us find the criminals. Yeah. And we don't think about like, okay, in a world where political dissidence is criminalized, do we want this caliber of surveillance and enforcement? And so, yeah, it can change whether people choose to exercise their free speech, their freedom to associate. It can change basically how people behave and where they choose to be and where they don't choose to be. And then the last thing I'll point out is that it gathers a lot of data on innocent people. These surveillance systems are largely black box systems, so we don't know everything that's pouring into them, but we can assume that it's like not only every policing and law enforcement database, it's also social media, it's perhaps shopping data from like people's rewards cards, it's license plate readers, it's facial recognition, it's DNA databases. Like, it is a huge amount of information being gathered on people who are kind of just minding their business. And in a pre-technological policing world, we didn't generally expect police to be spending this much effort or have this much information on people who are just minding their business. I mean, sure, there might be, as I pointed out, a police officer who kind of like has it in for somebody and follows them around too much. Like, sure, we're always going to have surveillance of innocent bystanders, but the scale of it here, it's not a sometimes somebody scale, it's an all the time everybody scale, including you, including me. And I think we really need to question whether that's something we want.
You immediately piqued my interest here with giving some examples of the data, and you said like rewards cards activity. And so I have to jump into there and just ask, okay, what is the pipeline here for data for these predictive policing systems? And my first one there is, what type of data gets fed into these programs? Because it already sounds like too much, but again, what type of data is getting fed into these programs?
I'm going to give you the scariest answer of all, which is we don't know. We don't know. I mean, I can tell you for some of them. So let's start with a really boring but important point, which is we need to look at whether they're incorporating arrest data versus crime data. Crimes are things that happen. And when a crime happens, sometimes people call and report that crime. And so it's a pretty objective measure of like what's going on in a place.
Yeah.
Arrests, though, are not an objective measure. They are a police decision. So when arrest data is fed into a system versus crime data being fed into a system, we have the system operating based on pre-existing police decisions versus on external objective conditions. So thing number one is like, which thing is this AI crunching?
Yeah.
And then, I think that it is reasonable to assume that when we talk about predictive policing, obviously all of these different technologies are incorporating as much data as they can. I can't tell you specifically which. I can tell you what's available to police generally. So like, obviously many police departments have access to facial recognition technology, huge networks of surveillance cameras. There was a really problematic deal for a while where police were like, had a deal with the company Ring that makes the doorbells, where they could do an incentive to people that if people would install a Ring doorbell, the police would pay for it as long as the homeowner agreed to point the camera in a particular direction for like the first year or something. That has since ended, but like it gives you a sense of like what they're going for, right? Like this is obviously surveillance of social media. In the past, again, this looked like a police officer scrolling through someone's Facebook. Now with AI, it's very, very different. I think what's important to recognize here, and I haven't even gotten into like shot spotter technology yet, which is, I think it's now called sound thinking. That's a technology where if there's a loud bang in the neighborhood, a computer calls the police.
Yeah.
We should probably talk about how dangerous that is for people living in the neighborhood who have police showing up, like all keyed up because someone slammed a dumpster.
Yeah.
But the thing that I really want to get to here is, in the past, if a police officer wanted your cell phone records, your text messages, your social media, your tweets, like whatever personal data they might have wanted. Your rewards card purchases, you got a Target circle, whatever it is, and they want to know, are you buying a lot of like baggies and scales and like, does this person purchase too many small baggies? They would have to get a warrant for that, right? In the past, like that's a thing where they would have to they'd have to get a warrant and send a court order, it could be a warrant, could be a subpoena to Target to get that data on you. But now with data brokers, we also don't know how much data police are allowed to purchase. So generally purchasable data is anonymized. So I'm not super worried about like specific targeting through the purchasing of data. But I am worried about like neighborhood level targeting through the purchasing of data. I am worried about anything that a data broker can sell. They can sell to a police department who can then feed that into an algorithmic or AI predictive policing system, who can then use that system based on the purchases of people in neighborhood A to decide whether to hyper police neighborhood A. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it does make sense in the sense that like, it sounds like a system that we have no input in. And that feels very unfair. And it also makes me question especially with these purchases coming from data brokers, do law enforcement need a warrant to make those purchases?
No. But I want to go quickly to your point about what we consent to, right? Because generally, it's a very American idea to assume that governance requires the consent of the governed. We are increasingly living in a world where that is not true. Between Citizens United and hyper gerrymandering and all the things, like certainly things are being done to us by our government that we did not consent to and would not consent to.
Yeah.
I think there's a really interesting example in San Diego a few years ago. The city tried to put in more ShotSpotter technology. And again, ShotSpotter, now called Sound Thinking, is very dangerous for people who live there in a certain respect, which is if you live in a neighborhood where every time there's a loud bang, police show up thinking someone just shot a gun.
Yeah.
Imagine the mental condition police show up in when they think someone just shot a gun.
Yeah.
So if you're a kid playing on the street and like you drop a big board on the ground and like police show up in your location 20 minutes later or 15 minutes later, thinking you just shot someone.
Yeah.
It's very, very scary. And we don't see cities trying really hard to install ShotSpotter technology, again, in like wealthy neighborhoods, in privileged neighborhoods. We have this two-tiered system where wealthy people or people of privilege, generally higher education levels, whiteness, et cetera, are able to consent to their own governance and choose when to call in the police. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, hyper-police, low-income communities, primarily more Black and brown, those communities are asked to be policed in whatever way the police choose. But the people of San Diego really organized an effort to push back on their county's effort to install more of this technology, and they were successful for a time. I think that, you know, again, going back to Andrew Ferguson's book, he talks a lot about there should be a regular surveillance check-in, like an annual meeting where police are required to report to the community how they are surveilling the community and what technologies they are using, and give community members an opportunity to say, yes, this makes me feel safer, but this other thing does not make me feel safer. And I want this, but not that. This is a thing we see almost nowhere. In fact, usually when police bring in this technology, they're not telling anybody about it. Mm-hmm. Community members have to find out through whatever means. So having more accountability and more transparency, or really like any transparency, would probably be a very good thing for the consent of governance.
I think it's also important to note here, when we're talking about ShotSpotter and sound thinking, sound technology, it also doesn't work. We did an episode about protecting kids in schools and like surveillance technology that's happening in U.S. schools to detect a school shooting as it's happening as quickly as possible. And there are classrooms in the U.S. that are experimenting, piloting, essentially having microphones in their classrooms to detect shots and to detect screams. It is as gruesome as it sounds, right? And lo and behold, if you have microphones in a classroom and like they're kids and it's detecting simply like an increase in decibels, it's going to detect every single time they go to recess. It's going to detect.
Have they ever been in a school like as the like 3:00 bell rings and everyone's like, I'm going home. Like, yeah, that's insane.
It just doesn't work. And so that's a kind of point here of like, yeah, a lot of sounds sound like a lot of sounds. Like, I don't know how else to put it. And so, just to reiterate, the technology doesn't work. That's all it is. And like you said, especially in a case where, one, the technology doesn't work, but also it is alarming a police response that is as serious as it can get, right? Responding to a shooting. That's a dangerous, I'd say, data decision to make. That's kind of bizarre. It does make me also ask, okay, how do these systems get made then? Because I also don't understand where this is taking place. And I'm curious, are police departments themselves, are they just like, hey, we have all this data. We're already buying all this data. Like, let's make a system ourselves. Or are they like going to tech companies and tech companies are making products that they can buy off the shelf? Help me understand, how are these systems getting made?
I think for the most part, tech companies see a huge opportunity to market a product to one of the best funded, if not the best funded governmental entity in America. I guess I have to acknowledge that like ICE is currently the best funded governmental entity of any kind, who I assume is using all of the technologies. Yeah. Look, a budget is a statement of values. Most places value safety above everything else. Most places also have not had the opportunity to read the research showing that actual safety comes through housing, improving the quality of life in low-income neighborhoods, higher educational attainment, giving kids stuff to do after school, especially stuff with Wi-Fi, changing through streets into cul-de-sacs. There's like a million low-cost, simple safety interventions that would probably work better than throwing all of the money we have into police departments, and also tasking police, I should say, to be fair to them, with dealing with every one of our social problems.
Yeah.
However, the world we live in right now is one in which police have massive quantities of funding. And with that funding, they can purchase any technology they want. There's certainly a lot of like governmental databases that are going to this. There's the NCIC, which is the National Crime Information Center. That's searchable by all police. It's got local, state, and federal data in it. Has a ton of data in it, arrests, warrants, gang affiliations, probation, parole, but also like property ownership, driver's licenses, commercial driver's licenses, identity theft history. This is accessed 12 million times a day by police. So on the one hand, police are starting out from having a ton of data. The National Data Exchange Program, or like CODIS, which is a combined DNA index. There's a ton of data out there. These companies see an opportunity, like we're seeing in every other sector, to be like, what if AI could just take your data and tell you where all the crimes will be? And it's very tempting. I mean, imagine if you are a police department, let's say you're a small town police department with like really limited resources and you don't have enough people to go to all the places where you would like to have a police presence. It's very tempting to want to have a map where it just tells you where to go on any given day. And then you just follow the computer and maybe you'll be in the right place at the right time and crimes will not happen. That is very tempting as a sales pitch. Yeah. Because a lot of this is so new, and also because it's very hard to prove a negative, like, did a crime not happen because someone was there that day? We don't know. And it's also black box technology, so we don't really know what's going into it. We don't really know why its outputs are what they are. It's easy to sell. If I were selling a product, I would say I would have a very easy time selling this product to police. So I don't think that this is something that police are creating themselves. No, it's not. It's largely not created in-house, although obviously police, all departments have a different set of databases they routinely utilize and draw from. It's Palantir. It's Predpol. It's these companies that are out there creating things they know are saleable and selling them to police departments.
When you were mentioning like so many of the other ways, like so many of the other means and measures that could be taking place to like help address crime, like turning through streets into cul-de-sacs and like giving kids after school programs, it just makes me think we're thinking too narrowly when we have an AI product, because things like infrastructure, like urban planning, are so exciting to me. And I wanted to actually ask, okay, do we know what does work in terms of safety? If safety is the thing that, communities value a lot, which I agree, do we know how to obtain that safety in non-AI assisted ways?
We totally do. That's actually one of the most frustrating things for someone in my perspective who researches this and talks about this all the time, is that like there are very, very, very achievable, well-tested solutions that any community can implement. And the thing that drives me nuts is if we embrace predictive policing as our path to safety and we're wrong, we end up in Minority Report, mass surveillance world, being wrong a lot and having the innocent people be hyper surveilled and changing the freedoms that are available to us and putting us at risk of very easy oppression by a change in the law or in enforcement priorities. On the stuff that we know is great at creating safety, that has more to do with care, access to resources, and environmental design, like our worst case scenario, if we're totally wrong and actually none of that works, is that we have like a much more beautiful society with like things that people want to have. I'll give you some examples. So like giving unhoused people access to housing reduces the likelihood that they will be arrested by like 80%. We know that housing lowers crime.
Yeah.
It also lowers the likelihood that they're going to end up in the ER, thus lowering public health costs. But like other stuff, if you beautify a neighborhood by like adding street lighting, painting the sidewalks, beautifying parks. There was a study in Philadelphia that showed those kinds of interventions can drop homicides by 75%.
What?
I mean, even when we look at the predictive policing, like even if we credit some of the wibbly wobbliest claims on safety, we're talking about like 8%, 9%, 10% gains. But like these other interventions, massively beneficial. Another study in Los Angeles, showed that turning through streets into cul-de-sacs massively reduced crime in those neighborhoods because people couldn't do a crime and then flee, and also because it creates a feeling of community. And I really want to talk about the feeling piece because when we look at what works in terms of environmental design and safety, a lot of what we see is not that surveillance equals safety. You can put up as many video cameras as you want in a dilapidated, empty lot. It is still going to be a place where people choose to occasionally sell or use drugs.
Yeah.
But if you turn that vacant lot into a small park, especially if you do it with the involvement of community members, there's actually research on this showing that like if the city beautifies a lot, it has a reduction in crime in that lot. If the community comes together to co-create a mini park, it's going to have a much more substantial reduction in crime in that lot. I'm convinced that the difference here is not that the place is surveilled, but rather that the place feels cared for. If you are wandering into the place considering doing a crime, you look around you and you're like, nah, this feels like a place where people might be or people might come. This does not feel like a safe place to do a crime. More research is on like, and I think this is really fascinating, trees. Like proximity to trees makes people act better.
Hell yeah.
Some of my favorite research on this, I used to think that like if a building had a lot of tree cover, if it was a heavily greened building, it might be like a little easier to burglarize because you just like crawl right in that window and like nobody's going to see you because you're behind a bush. But in fact, the research on this suggests that heavy greenery, especially older trees, bigger trees around buildings, not only reduces property crime outside the building, it can reduce domestic violence inside the building. And these are actually fairly well-constructed studies that are not looking at correlation. They're really looking at if we change this neighborhood, what happens to it? Or they're well-structured studies that compare apples to apples. After-school programs, this is such a no-brainer, right? If you give kids a place to be and a thing to do after school, they are less likely to do crimes.
Yep.
So the studies on this are about after-school programs, particularly after-school programs with Wi-Fi, because guess what kids love? The internet lowers youth involvement in crime. Access to healthcare. There's research showing that in the jurisdictions this particular study looked at, the size of the jail population was more closely correlated with the availability or unavailability of mental health services than with the actual crime rate, showing that if we open up more availability of mental health services, we can lower the jail population because there will be fewer people who are stuck in jail just because they are having issues with behavioral control. And it's a huge issue for us. Like right now, New York's Rikers Island, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and the LA County Jail, each of them holds more people with a mental health condition than any hospital in America. Basically, the interventions we're talking about largely relate to three themes, I would say. Housing, both the availability of housing and like the quality of housing. Again, like there's another study that shows that for every house you repair or restore on a dilapidated block, you see a substantial drop in the crime rate surrounding that house. The second category is income. There was a new study that came out showing, this is a really depressing example, so brace yourself, but when a blood plasma center opens in a low-income neighborhood, like so people can literally sell their bodily fluids to survive. Again, we are living in the worst possible timeline, but it creates an income stream and crime around that area drops substantially. So if you give people housing and income and access to healthcare, again, availability of mental health resources in particular, but also substance use care and the ability to deal with chronic conditions, like those three things create the conditions under which we may reach a world where prisons and jails are no longer even necessary. And investing in those things obviously also has other benefits, greater economic mobility, lower public health costs, like more thriving communities where people actually have the means to go out and about and shop at corner stores. So if I were a lawmaker and I wanted to get a lot of bang for how I spend my tax revenue in my jurisdiction, I would be investing in all of these things that might be slower burning and less flashy, and they're not going to give people that hot feeling of, Tom Cruise in Minority Report or whatever feeling it is they're going for. But it's like, it's the unsexy, boring, long-term interventions that are going to not only lower crime, but create a much more thriving economy, as opposed to pouring that money into mass surveillance, which, although it might be something that companies are succeeding in selling, it's not creating a world we want to live in.
There are so many measures in there and methods that are just so cool. I don't know how else to put it.
Let me tell you just quickly.
Yeah.
People often want to know where the heck I got all of that data.
Yes.
If you go to the Partners for Justice website, it's partnersforjustice.org. We have a tab on our website called Evidence. And in there, we've done collections of all of the studies that I just mentioned. They're all in there, organized by subject matter. Obviously, I put a lot of it also into the book that I have coming out in February. But yeah, all of the research is out there. I have the receipts, and that's where my receipts are if people want to check my receipts.
Yeah, I love this stuff about trees. I also know, I learned this recently, that trees in a city, particularly if they're along like streets, they slow down speeds. People drive slower when there are trees, and driving slower helps prevent car accidents. It helps prevent pedestrians getting hit, bicyclists getting hit. And so, yeah, trees are like the sickest thing in the world.
And be careful, though. I mean, like when people are driving slower, and there's great research on this about how we construct streets to encourage safer driving rather than enforcing safer driving through ticketing systems. Like if you have like little medians that you got to drive around and some pretty trees and a lot of flowers and bushes and like a cul-de-sac here and there, you don't have police pulling people over to enforce safe driving. You don't have police-civilian encounters that can be dangerous for both the civilian and the police officer. You don't have people getting dragnetted into a court system that puts them in debt. There's a whole study on debt showing that people with court debt actually may be likelier to commit future crimes to try to pay back that debt. So you bypass all of that toxic cycling and you have a beautiful tree-lined street. Again, this is the no-brainer intervention.
We were mentioning here, a lot of discussion of this like Minority Report world, and it's not the world we want to live in, but I did want to get some examples. We had that one at the top here in the intro to the episode that was happening in Florida, but do we know of other examples where police departments in the U.S. are using predictive policing systems? And also, how does that affect the people in those neighborhoods?
I think it's at this point probably easier to find places that are not using it. I mean, I've heard different counts. I heard an interview with Andrew Ferguson where he talked about like 60 departments using, I think it was algorithmic technologies. I don't want to get that wrong, but there are other, I listened to a 2023 report on this where they were talking about at least 100 departments around the country using predictive policing. It's really hard to say. And it's also something that people would not immediately know is happening to them, right?
Yeah.
Police technology is super insidious. I remember when I was a public defender, we were thinking about ways to put in our motions to get various forms of discovery, which means like to get the police and the prosecutors to like tell us what they did to arrest this person, to find out more about stingray and triggerfish, which are technologies police can use to spoof a cell phone tower and thus track the location of a person's cell phone, because the person's cell phone will be pinging the police instead of pinging the nearest tower. And, that data wasn't being handed over in our standard discovery. Like we had to very specifically and assiduously work to get that data and even find out about it to know to ask for it. So these things are really, really hidden from view. I also think that in terms of the sensation of surveillance, the people who are most likely to be experiencing this are people who have already been experiencing surveillance. So for example, let's look at gang documentation. Gang documentation is something in this country that has been really ludicrously willy-nilly for a very long time. My favorite example of this is that CalGang, which is the California gang database, into which police put people who the police decide are gang affiliated. Again, this is a decision not like of the person's own admission necessarily. It's police being like, well, they hang out with this person, they go to this place, they doodled this thing in their notebook, they had this tattoo. The CalGang database contained a bunch of infants, like people less than 1 year old who were listed in the CalGang database as having admitted their gang membership. So it's like, we just saw a great example of this being the people who were sent to a torture prison in El Salvador for having like an autism awareness tattoo or a memorial to their mom and dad. Like police are very, very sloppy at how they throw people into the category of surveilled. Because again, gang documentation puts the person in the category of being surveilled. And this may happen when a person's as young as 7 or 8 years old. I mean, I don't know how much they're surveilling the gang babies in California, but I've represented people whose first contact with police was when they were 7 or 8. When the police, because they had an older brother who was gang, designated, started following them home from school, stopping them, searching them, talking to them. Again, these are children. So communities that have been experiencing surveillance aren't necessarily going to notice if the surveillance goes from this cop doesn't like your tattoo to this cop's algorithm doesn't like your tattoo. And so that's why, again, going back to Andrew Ferguson's discussion of like these meetings that we need to have. Communities need to be pushing and asking for and filing FOIA requests and, freedom of information law requests to get the information on how police are using new technologies. Are they using sound thinking? Are they using Palantir? Are they using Intrado? That's the program in Sacramento is called the Beware program, owned by Intrado. Are they using Predpol? Are they using Stingray or Triggerfish? As you can probably tell just from that list I rattled off, it's hard for ordinary people to even get the information about the stuff they should be asking about. The good news is you can write really, really general freedom of information requests. Like literally anything you're using that has an algorithm or has a battery, like I want you to tell me about. Facial recognition software, great example, used essentially everywhere at this point. Yeah. Really, really, really bad at correctly identifying people of color. I think that there was an article in the New York Times maybe a couple of days ago about a guy who was arrested for a crime that had been carried out by a 160-pound person. And he himself weighed like 230 pounds and was like a foot taller than the described suspect. But because they were using facial recognition technology and he is a black man with a beard, that technology is just really, really inaccurate. And he was literally arrested and spent time in jail under circumstances which, if we were relying on regular eyewitnesses, he may never have been arrested. These are the kinds of signs that people need to be looking for, or even just preventatively sending freedom of information requests and setting meetings with their police department.
We were talking a lot about surveillance and the impact it has on folks, and it makes me curious about this big, last question I've been wanting to ask. I visited a prison last year here in California called San Quentin, and I actually met a lot of the folks who were staying there, inmates who were really hopeful about their future. We met a fellow who was studying for his parole hearing, and we met a lot of students who were getting their college degrees. There's a college, an accredited college inside San Quentin called Mount Tamalpais College, right? It's one of the only, if not the only, in the country. But these are people who are working on their degrees. I met two people who do the podcast inside the prison, which is so cool. And all of these folks are just looking forward to what's happening after, right? But it seems like everything we've been talking about today, right? Predictive policing algorithms, they would suggest that these same people's criminal past is justification for their surveillance forever. And I think that greatly hinders their opportunity outside prison. So my question here is, does predictive policing not poison the very experiment we have of rehabilitative justice? Does it not cut it short at the knees?
Yes, it absolutely diminishes one of the most important things that we have for people to do well when they are surviving incarceration, and that thing is hope. I'm so glad that you went to San Quentin, because San Quentin is one of the least depressing prisons in America. I mean, all prisons are deeply depressing. There's a film coming out by Andrew Jarecki called The Alabama Solution, which if people are curious about what it's like to live inside a prison and what the role that hope plays would be, I really encourage them to watch that film. But in San Quentin, there is the kind of resourcing that is most important for people to do well when they come home. Let's start with this. 98% of people who are in prison come home from prison. Pretty much nobody goes away forever. So we as a society get to decide how people are when they come home. Do we want them to be people who have survived decades of tortuous solitary confinement, lack of good food, lack of education, lack of opportunity, slave labor? Because remember, the 13th Amendment does allow slave labor in prison, and we as a country continue to embrace slave labor in prison. Voters in California failed to eliminate slave labor in a recent election. So do we want people to come out of years of suffering, bitterness, lack of opportunity, and lack of hope? Or do we want to do what, Mount Tamalpais is doing, and also the Barred Prison Initiative and other educational institutions that teach inside prisons? Do we want people to get an education? Do we want them to have meaningfully compensated labor so that they can save up a nest egg or send money home to their kids while they're in prison? Do we want them to be engaging in acts of high responsibility and sort of citizenship while they are in prison? Do we want them to, there's great research suggesting that voting might actually be rehabilitative. Don't we want people to have a political voice and actually participate in their community while they are in prison? Generally, all of the research suggests that the more we can help people do well while they're in, the better they're going to do when they come home. And helping people do well when they come home is really urgent in this country because we have like a 60% recidivism rate that I consider to be our fault, not other people's fault. Because largely what our prisons do is torture people and steal their hope and opportunity. So to answer your question, yes, bringing people home into a world where they will be constantly surveilled forever is massively destructive, especially to people who are trying to do well. In this book that I have coming out in February, I talk about the story of a guy named Malcolm who is doing amazing things with his life. You know, he did some time in prison. He's home now, and he is working, you know, in education. He got his master's degree. He's really high achieving. I think right now he's actually working on his PhD. But because of the way that carceral experience has followed him, he's had a really, really hard time securing the employment opportunities that a person who had done as well as he's done in various educational programs should be getting. Having yourself be on a heat map or always be at the top of the list for police interrogation, having your face be constantly popping up for police attention, living in a neighborhood where you have to be constantly surveilled. I mean, backing up for a second, when people come home and they're on parole, people on probation or parole often have to comply with as many as 25 different conditions per day. And these can be really hard to comply with. Like, oh, you have to wear this ankle monitor and you have to charge it up, but also you have to go get a job, but you have to leave your job to charge it up at these intervals. And oh, by the way, you have to have a job, but you also have to leave your job to come in for a check-in with your PO to do a drug test in the middle of a weekday, and you got to do it 3 times a week. So your boss at whatever job you're going to get is going to have to be okay with you skipping out on the office a bunch of times every week and wearing an ankle monitor in front of customers. You think you can get a job that way? Already people are dealing with surveillance and impossible conditions. When you add technology to that, thus increasing the frequency of their negative contacts with our governmental apparatus, no, it drives people into the kind of despair that makes them kind of give up on this community and this system altogether.
Emily, I wanted to thank you again for coming on today's show, for telling us all about this stuff. You did mention earlier that you are working on a book that's coming out. What's that book going to be about?
Yeah, so the book is called The Price of Mercy. It's coming out in February. February 17th is its birthday. I'm really excited about it because, as you can tell, a lot of lay people don't know what's really happening inside their public safety systems, inside their police departments, inside their courthouses, inside their prisons and jails. And so what this book is it's all of the things a person should know about what's really happening inside. And also about a third of the book is dedicated to really well-tested, proven solutions. So if people want to hear more about after-school programs and cul-de-sacs, like all of that research and all of these brilliant initiatives that have already been proven to work well, they're all in the book as well. It is available for pre-order. If people want to get ahead of things, it obviously helps a book have much bigger reach when people pre-order it. So if this kind of data is interesting, I hope people might want to dip in.
Thank you so much for coming on today's show.
Thanks for having me.
To our listeners, we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Until then, stay tuned and stay safe. And remember, you can read all our cybersecurity coverage on Malwarebytes Labs at malwarebytes.com/blog. Finally, our intro music is by Kevin MacLeod from incompetech.com, and our outro music is by Woa from unminus.com. Today's show has been edited by our podcast consultant, Eric Johnson, at lightningpod.fm. Thank you, folks.